Please be seated. Today's opening collect includes, "We have no help but God." I don't know how you feel about that. You might feel that you have a lot of help, that you hold the world in the palm of your hand. And I hope you feel like that, but I'm guessing maybe not so much, or you probably wouldn't come to this altar week after week. The Bible tells us that our days are numbered. The Bible tells us of the folly at times of our planning. Life is full of whim and cruelty and disaster. So what is our purpose, the writers ask? Why do our neighbors suffer? Please tell me it won't come from me, the readings seem to ask. They must have done something to deserve their plight. We are like so many fig trees, we and our people, fruitless, awaiting a kind gardener to lay the compost. Now, probably like you, I laid a lot of compost last week. Fingers crossed that another frost is not coming to Atlanta, because these warm days are so inviting to be out in a garden. I couldn't help it. We're keeping an eye on that bird's nest I mentioned a few weeks ago. It is still in the bike helmet. We're hoping to see some bird parents and for some good luck for those eggs. The hope of spring has caught my imagination. There are seeds in the ground at our house, and I know you're not supposed to do it yet, but we did. But these readings pull me back to Lent. We are in Lent. It pulls us all back to the news that I'm not really reading, to the helplessness that is so often our state in this life, and the power and responsibility that is also ours. Of God, these readings tell us, responsibilities of God and us for one another. In the first reading, Moses is a shepherd of the flocks of his father-in-law, Jethro. Remember, Moses has left Egypt. He's fled because he murdered a man. Moses was an adopted prince of Egypt, the son of an enslaved Hebrew family, adopted by a princess of Egypt instead of murdered himself as a baby. And he seems to know this story. He knows where he's come from, because he sees a Hebrew slave being beaten by an Egyptian overseer, and in a rage, he kills the Egyptian, and then he runs, which is why he's out where he is today. He is the saved, beloved child of Amram and Jochebed, brother of Miriam and Aaron. But what had he been saved for? Fleeing out of Egypt to save his own life? But it works out for him. He finds a wife, Zipporah, the daughter of the priest of Midian, Jethro. Yes, the great liberator Moses marries a foreigner, and you can file that for whenever you need to use it. A woman of the family of the priest of another god. That is the story of Moses today. So Moses is living this new life in peace, as far as we can see in the Bible, safe from the rage of Pharaoh for his acts, and safe from the vulnerability of his own people and his own family. Here in his peace, maybe a peace interrupted by memory or dreams, God comes to him in a fire, a captivating, burning bush, burning but not consumed, so it doesn't stop burning. This image is carved in stone above the entryway of the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, a central image in the learning of rabbis. God's call to us, God's proclamation to Moses, "I am the God of the miracles of your ancestors, the one that made you, the one that protects you, the one that reconciles you to one another. I am." And Moses answers rightly. Moses says, "I am not the one. I must not be the one that you expected to walk by today. This must be a mistake. I am only Moses, the doomed one, the screwing up one, the ragey one, the speech impediment one, the wanted one." And you know where this story goes. God doesn't fix Moses. God goes with Moses into the impossible, the heart of political and military power in their times, back to Egypt to free his people. And like that fig tree that has not produced in the gospel reading today, and I have one of those in my yard, this is very close, a favorite of squirrels and other thieves that come in the night, my little fig tree last year, I think, took a break from even trying, a break from the violence. I like to believe it's working on its roots, but I don't know. But let's make the very obvious connection for you today. As we read of the dismantling of our government agencies as we have come to know them, the randomness and cruelty are one thing, part of the plan, not an error. A cruelty we have seen in our public life before, one that we have been set up for a long time, with long-running, unproven claims that government, by definition, is wasteful. And of course, there's always room for reform in everything, in business, of course, right? But government is us. Government is civil rights, desegregation, education, the mail. Government is wasteful, we have been told, by definition, as though government workers are not people like us doing jobs, as though those jobs don't serve every one of us with the services and protections that are among the things to be most proud of as a nation. Safe medicines, affordable mail, loans to go to colleges where minds can soar freely to challenge and imagine and equip better futures, a safety net for the elderly and the disabled, cutting-edge research, care of those who fight our wars, regulation of industry to protect consumers. Those services for the American people are being framed as fraud and excess, the slashing of real jobs for real people, the point of our collective, our taxes, our commitments to one another, mocked as excess, pretending nothing good can happen from the commons when we put our heads together and decide to do something bigger and better than ourselves. And we have the perfect set of readings to understand how that works today in this moment, because they contain in them both the original story in that beautifully read, long first lesson, right? And that story, and then the reading in Corinthians, which retells the story slightly askew, kind of retelling differently what we have in the first readings. And it's worth it going back to look at exactly how that's done, because there's an agenda in Corinthians and you can kind of hear it. So remember what happens in the wilderness with Moses. The freed people are with Moses, and they're becoming a people. They hadn't been free before. They hadn't been together in that way before. So these people are learning how to follow God together in all of their messiness, which is as messy as us today, learning how to be a people together. And we can see ourselves in their story so easily, which is why it is a timeless story. There are snakes and desert. They remember blankets and lamb and mushrooms in Egypt. It was so nice. And the God to whom they must lift their eyes to follow into freedom, unfamiliar freedom, the God of great miracles, saves them. Water flows from rocks, food falls from the sky, their lives of abundance and submission and generosity together, so blessed, so regularly for them turns to fear and diminishment because they are so easily misled, just like us. And why do the writers remind us of this so often? Because this is the story of humans. God guides with fiery pillar and stand of cloud cannot be missed, but we put our heads down and follow the cynic in every generation. It's just us, after all. How much can we do? And marketplace dynamics, right? What can we control? Because the powers of this world seem so very powerful in all times. Maybe if we align ourselves with that power, we will not be victim to it. I guess the virtue of a moment like this in our public life is that it is so clear that no one is really safe. Maybe a few years ago you could imagine how you were far from a vulnerable person in this world, but I'm not sure any of us can now, especially not after Tony stood up here last week and told us what cuts in the programs we're talking about means for the people who seek help at Crossroads right here on this campus. We can help, of course, and we will, but we can't make up for the scale of resources we need in this city to get people safely off the streets with mental health care and food support and housing and work support to stabilize their lives. We can help, and we will, but let's be very clear about it. Tony's people need legislation and fewer prisons and opportunity and city and state funding, which overwhelmingly comes from federal funding, the government, to make the kind of difference they need in their lives and that many of you work on every day of your lives. These are the people living their lives right now, all the time, in real time, like us, not just when we have time to be generous to them. Moses and Jesus stand in the mess of the daily lives of people just like this. Moses asks to be spared. He was wise enough to know what was coming. He's just minding his own business and trying to stay out of Pharaoh's jail. But God has another plan for him and for the people, a covenanted life of obligation to follow God's ways. And to be clear, to be a covenanted, just people is not a claim of land or territory by any means necessary. Covenant is obligation. Obligation we voluntarily take upon ourselves. This is what we inherit from these stories, the idea of joining God's covenant ourselves in baptism and through the baptismal covenant. We promise to follow and to serve, and this is the way of Jesus. The way of love that Bishop Curry reminds us is the way of the Episcopal Church. The challenge in every time is that love takes away freedom. Love, covenanted, is obligation. It is care and relationship. It is equal, empowered, and curious, but it is obligation. We seek to know the ones we love, and collectively we seek justice and wholeness for those that struggle in the world as it is. That is love in public for the common good. Francis Perkins, the Blessed Francis Perkins, probably, and I'm guessing into the future, will be the only Secretary of Labor in the Saints' Calendar of the Episcopal Church, Francis Perkins. Francis Perkins was an Episcopalian who died in the early 1960s and was an architect of the New Deal. She was a witness to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911, if you remember that from your history books, which catalyzed the labor movement in this country. That factory fire in the Lower East Side in New York was witnessed by many. People stood and watched it burn, notable because the doors were locked, so that the people inside, overwhelmingly immigrant women, could not leave work until the owners wanted them to leave. So those locked doors meant that they could not escape this fire. And people stood on the street and watched helplessly as the building burned with them in it. They could not do anything to help. It was horrific. Like the wildfires we see so regularly now, except all of that harm was avoidable. Vulnerable people sacrificed for the greed of a few. Francis Perkins was an Episcopalian in a time of church engagement, of urban immigrant struggle, a terrible time in this country. This is the Great Depression and huge groups of immigrants moving into this country from a starving Europe. The settlement house movement and schemes like that to help working men, it always said, though these were women that I'm talking about, were coming out of all of the mainline churches at the time. When I was at St. Mark's in the Bowery, also in the East Village and Lower East Side, I had a letter from the Roosevelt administration pinned to a board above my desk because they wrote to all of the churches like St. Mark's at the time as they were researching what would become Social Security, asking about a program in the neighborhood that was helping working men. How do we do it? It said. How do we help the school teacher who can no longer work, who has no family to care for her, or the factory worker that has been injured, or the veteran of our wars with no way to make an income, or the most vulnerable among us, as we say here in church? In the Gospels today, the people and Jesus ask, why did our neighbors, our fellow Israelites, suffer so cruelly at the hands of Pilate, at the hands of government, in our temple? What did they do? And do you hear it? Trying to separate the victims from themselves? Were they reckless? Do they have a moral flaw that we can't see? Are they really like us? Jesus says it was Rome. It was power, cruelly exercised, and you are no different than them, like a fig tree, afraid to bloom. Friends, there is no time when some will not invite you to point a finger somewhere else. Even Paul likes to say, well, here's why the things didn't work out for them. But let's go back to the beginning, to the I Am, the rock that leaks water in the desert for the thirsty, the God of abundance who calls us by name for freedom to set others free. The God who called a generation of our Episcopal ancestors 100 years ago across this country to live among the newest immigrants and factory workers in settlement houses and work to support their dignity so well that 100 years later, their great-great-grandchildren are seamlessly integrated into every aspect of American life, essential to the brilliance of this nation. There will always be those who dehumanize and try to rile us up with fear, to turn us against each other, to defend our bigotry. there will always be snakes and tempest and fire. But the rabbis say that bush is still burning somewhere out there in a wild place, a place you might pass by every day, near where you have run for comfort, far from temple and political dome, not like a wildfire that threatens, but a fire still, a flame, calling us by name, from the great I Am, that called Francis Perkins through a fire to redefine American possibility, that called Martin King and John Lewis to the streets of the segregated South, a flame that stirs up in us, a covenanted people, whenever we are asked to turn away from the suffering of one another. So we started today by praying, we have no help but God. And again, I know some of us don't like to think so poorly of ourselves, but isn't it simply the truth? God's help to us is to remind us of who we are, to look up and to look out at that pillar of fire and stand of cloud, and to remember we are on our way to freedom, and we are bound together in a garment of destiny, woven together by memory and love and faith and proximity and history, family ties, neighborhood ties, common commitments and care, and unlikely things like taxes and legislation, because God can work with anything. All gifts and tools of God, the work of our hands for the glory of God, the great I Am, who has called us for this time.